Today we will be reading from the book Swamiji and his message, written by Sister Nivedita. Om Namah Sri Atirajaya Vivekananda Surai Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. We were reading from the chapter Golden Memories. Today I will be reading from July 29. From this time we saw very little of the Swami. He was full of enthusiasm about the pilgrimage and lived mostly on one meal a day, seeking no company much save that of sadhus. Sometimes he would come to a camping ground, beads in hand. Tonight, two of the party went roaming about Bhawan, which was like a village fair, all modified by a religious tendency, centering in the sacred springs. Afterwards, with Dhira Mata, it was possible to go and listen at the tent door to the crowd of Hindi-speaking sadhus who were plying the Swami with questions. On Thursday, we reached Pahalgam and camped down at the lower end of the valley. We found that the Swami had to encounter high opposition over the question of our admission at all. He was supported by the naked Swamis, one of whom said, "It is true you have this strength, Swamiji, but you ought not to manifest it." He yielded at the word. That afternoon, however, he took his daughter round the camp to be blessed, which really meant to distribute alms, and whether because he was looked upon as rich or because he was recognized as strong, the next day our tents were moved up to a lovely knoll at the head of the camp, where we had the Russian Lidar in front of us and pine-covered mountains opposite, with a glacier distinctively visible beyond a cleft high up. We stayed a whole day at the village of the shepherds to keep Ekadashi, and early next morning the pilgrims left. August 2. On Tuesday, August the 2nd, the great day of Amarnath, the first batch of pilgrims must have left the camp at 2. We left by the light of the full moon. The sun rose as we went down the narrow valley. It was not too safe at this part of the journey. But when we left our dandies and began to climb, the real danger began. A sort of goat path in almost vertical hillsides, becoming in the descent on the other side a tiny staircase in the turf. Every here and there delicate columbines, Michaelmas daisies and wild roses tempted one to risk life and limb in their acquisition. Then, having at last reached the bottom of the farther slope, we had to toil along the glacier mile after mile to the cave. About a mile before our destination, the ice ceased, and in the flowing water the pilgrims had to bathe. Even when we seemed to have arrived, there was still quite a still ascent over the rocks to be made. The Swami, exhausted, had by this time fallen behind, but I, not remembering that he might be ill, waited below the banks of gravel for his appearance. He came at last, and with a word sent me on. He was going to bathe. Half an hour later, he entered the cave. With a smile, he knelt, first at the one end of the semicircle, then at the other. The place was vast, large enough to hold a cathedral, and the great ice Shiva, in a nick of deepest shadow, seemed as if throned on its own base. A few minutes passed, and then he turned to leave the cave. To him the heavens had opened. He touched the feet of Shiva. He had to hold himself tight, he said afterwards, lest he should swoon away. But so great was his physical exhaustion that a doctor said afterwards that his heart ought to have stopped beating and had undergone a permanent enlargement instead. How strangely near fulfillment had been those words of his master, when he realizes who and what he will give up his body. I have enjoyed it so much, he said half an hour afterwards, as he sat on a rock above the streamside, eating lunch with the kind naked Swami and myself. I thought the ice lingam was Shiva himself, and there were no thievish brahmanas, no trade, nothing wrong. It was all worship. I never enjoyed any religious place so much. Afterwards, he would often tell of the overwhelming vision that had seemed to draw him almost into its vortex. He would talk of the poetry of the white ice pillar, and it was he who suggested that the first discovery of the place had been by a party of shepherds who had wandered far in search of their flocks one summer day and had entered the cave to find themselves before the unmelting ice in the presence of the Lord himself. He always said, too, that the grace of Amarnath had been granted to him there not to die till he himself should give consent. And to me he said, you do not now understand, but you have made the pilgrimage and it will go on working. Causes must bring their effects. You will understand better afterwards. The effects will come. From Sisters Nivedita's Notes of Some Wanderings with the Swami Vivekananda. Thank you. Jai Swamiji.